Mama gorilla saves a baby from drowning in the river. You'll be shocked to discover why. The rainforest pulsed with life on that October morning. The humid air carried the scent of wet earth and wildflowers, while the first rays of sunlight lazily filtered through the treetops. In the heart of this green paradise, an imposing figure stood out. Sarah, the silverback gorilla, observed her kingdom with tired but watchful eyes. Sarah was no ordinary gorilla. Her name, given by the zookeepers where she spent much of her life, echoed a story of captivity and regained freedom. Now, reintroduced to nature, she carried with her memories of two worlds, that of humans with their routines and care, and that of the wild forest with its challenges and wonders. On that morning, as on every other since returning to nature, Sarah began her daily journey in search of food. Her movements were graceful, despite her considerable size. She moved with the caution of one who knows the dangers of the forest, but also with the confidence of one who feels at home. While gathering some succulent leaves, Sarah heard a distant noise. Her ears, sharpened by years of survival, caught the unmistakable sound of human voices. Normally, she would move away, seeking the safety of the dense forest. But something in those voices made her hesitate. There was a note of excitement, of anticipation, that piqued her curiosity. Moving silently between the trees, Sarah approached the source of the sound. As she advanced, the characteristic smell of humans grew stronger. Hidden behind a large oak tree, she observed a small clearing near the river. There, a human family was setting up a camp. Sarah's heart raced as she saw the scene. Memories of her time at the zoo flooded her mind. She remembered the visitors who watched her, the children who laughed and pointed, fascinated. But there was something more in this scene that intrigued her deeply. Among the adult humans there was a small child, a baby who could barely walk. The sight of the little being awakened in Sarah an emotion she had not felt for a long time. Her own offspring, lost a few months ago, came vividly back to her memory. The pain of loss, which she carried silently, seemed to intensify. Sarah watched, motionless as the family organized themselves. The adults were busy setting up tents and arranging equipment. The baby, curious and carefree, crawled through the grass, exploring its new environment. Its eyes shone with excitement, oblivious to the dangers that surrounded it. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The gorilla felt a pang of concern. She knew well the risks of the forest, especially for such a small and vulnerable being. Instinctively, she wanted to approach, to protect that defenseless creature. But years of conditioning kept her in place, hidden and silent. Hours passed, and Sarah remained at her observation post. She saw the family have a meal, play, and explore the surroundings. The baby, always curious, seemed magnetized by the sound of the nearby river. Several times Sarah noticed the parents calling the child back when it got too close to the edge. As the day progressed, Sarah felt a growing unease. Something in the air, perhaps, or a deeply rooted instinct, made her feel that something was about to happen. She watched the clouds gathering in the sky, promising rain. The wind changed direction, bringing with it the smell of an impending storm. The human family seemed to notice the change in weather. They began to collect some objects, preparing for what was to come. It was in this moment of distraction that the unthinkable happened. The baby, taking advantage of a moment when the adults were busy, began to move away from the camp. Its faltering steps led it towards the river, attracted by the shine of the water and the soft sound of the current. Sarah watched, horrified, as the child dangerously approached the slippery bank. A cry of alarm was stuck in Sarah's throat. She knew she couldn't reveal herself, that her presence could cause panic among the humans. But every fiber of her being screamed for her to act, to protect that small defenseless being. At that moment, the sky opened up. Heavy rain began to fall, creating a curtain of water that partially obscured the view. Sarah saw the adults running for shelter, calling for the child. But the sound of the rain and the river, now stronger, muffled their voices. The baby, startled by the sudden change, took a step back. It was enough. Its foot slipped on the wet earth, and in an instant, it fell into the agitated river. The child's scream cut through the air, overcoming the noise of the rain and the river. Sarah saw the small body being dragged by the current, its little arms flailing desperately in the water. Without thinking twice, she came out of her hiding place. With surprising speed for her size, Sarah ran towards the river. She ignored the cries of surprise and fear from the humans as they saw her. Nothing else mattered besides that small life in danger. Sarah plunged into the cold water, her powerful arms cutting through the current with determination. She swam with all the strength she possessed, guided by the maternal instinct that transcended species. Her eyes did not leave the baby, who was being carried farther and farther away by the force of the water. The fight against the current was fierce. Sarah felt her muscles burn with the effort, but she did not give up. She approached the baby with each powerful stroke. Time seemed to have slowed down, each second an eternity as she struggled to reach the child. Finally, with one last push, Sarah managed to reach the baby. With surprising gentleness, she held it against her chest, protecting it from the force of the water. The contact with the small trembling body awakened in Sarah a wave of emotions that she could barely understand. Carefully, but still fighting against the current, Sarah began to swim back to the shore. The baby, exhausted and frightened, clung to her as if its life depended on it, and indeed it did. When they finally reached the shore, Sarah came out of the water with the baby safe in her arms. She gently placed it on the ground, observing it with a mixture of concern and relief. The little human coughed, expelling water, and then began to cry. Instinctively, Sarah picked it up again, cradling it as she did with her own offspring. She emitted soft, guttural sounds in an attempt to calm the child. To her surprise, the crying gradually diminished until the baby calmed down in her arms. It was at this moment that Sarah noticed the silence around her. The rain had decreased to a light drizzle, and she could hear voices approaching. The child's parents, no doubt, were coming in search of their son. Sarah knew she should leave, disappear into the forest before the humans found her. But something prevented her. Looking at the baby in her arms, she felt a connection she couldn't explain. It was as if, for a brief moment, she had regained the child she had lost. With a heavy heart, Sarah gently placed the baby on the ground. She took a step back, watching as the child looked at her with curiosity. The voices were closer now. Sarah cast one last look at the baby, engraving every detail in her memory. Then, as silently as she had come, she disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a story that no one would believe, but that would change her life forever. As she moved away, Sarah felt something awaken within her, a sensation she hadn't experienced for a long time: purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she was sure that her life had irrevocably changed on that rainy day by the river. The days that followed the baby's rescue were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah. The gorilla, accustomed to the solitude of the forest, now found herself haunted by long-dormant memories and feelings. Every sound of the forest, every ray of sunlight penetrating the dense foliage, seemed to carry echoes of the event that had changed her life. Sarah wandered through the forest, her heavy steps marking familiar trails, but her heart was restless. The touch of the human baby's soft skin still reverberated in her calloused hands. The peculiar scent of the child, so different from the aromas of the forest, remained vivid in her memory. It was as if a part of her had stayed on that riverbank, along with the small being she had saved. On a particularly humid morning, Sarah found herself near the site of the human campground. The space, now empty, still carried traces of the family's presence. Half-erased footprints in the mud, a forgotten piece of plastic, the residual smell of human food. Sarah examined every detail with curiosity and a pang of longing that she didn't fully understand. As she searched the area, a shiny object caught her attention. Half buried in the damp earth was a small plastic rattle, probably belonging to the baby. Sarah picked it up delicately, turning it over in her huge hands. The object made a soft sound, and for a moment, the gorilla was fascinated, shaking it repeatedly. The sound of the rattle triggered an avalanche of memories. Sarah found herself transported back to her days at the zoo, where similar objects were used to stimulate and entertain the animals. She recalled the gentle keepers, the daily routines, the sounds and smells so different from the forest. It was a world she had left behind, but which now returned in full force. With the rattle firmly held in her hand, Sarah moved away from the old campsite. She walked aimlessly through the forest, her thoughts a confused mixture of past and present. The occasional sound of the rattle punctuated her journey, as if marking the rhythm of her reflections. As she walked, Sarah began to notice something strange. The forest animals, normally discreet in her presence, seemed more curious. Small capuchin monkeys followed her through the branches, chattering excitedly. Colorful birds flew in circles around her, as if attracted by the shine and sound of the rattle. Even a young tapir came out of the dense vegetation to watch her pass. This unusual attention made Sarah feel strangely exposed. She, who had always been an imposing and solitary presence in the forest, now found herself at the center of attention. The rattle in her hand, an artifact of the human world, seemed to create a bridge between her and the other creatures of the forest. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself arriving at a small clearing that she knew well. It was a special place where she used to take refuge in moments of greatest sadness after the loss of her offspring. There, surrounded by ancient trees and wildflowers, she always found a bit of peace. Sitting heavily on the soft ground, Sarah contemplated the rattle in her hand. The object, so small and insignificant, seemed to contain a whole universe of possibilities and memories. She shook it gently, letting the soft sound fill the air around her. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Attracted by the sound of the rattle, several young animals of the forest began to approach. A baby capuchin monkey, curious and fearless, was the first to come close. He looked at Sarah with wide eyes, extending a small hand to touch the rattle. Sarah, surprised by the approach, remained still. Her first instinct was to protect the object, but something made her hesitate. Slowly, she extended her hand, allowing the little monkey to touch the rattle. The small primate laughed with joy upon hearing the sound, jumping with excitement. Soon, other offspring joined. A young toucan landed nearby, tilting its head to hear better. Two capybara pups approached cautiously, their snouts moving with curiosity. Even a small ocelot, normally so elusive, watched the scene from a safe distance. Sarah found herself at the center of an unlikely gathering. Animals that would normally avoid each other were now united by curiosity and the sound of the rattle. The gorilla, moved by an instinct she couldn't explain, began to interact with the offspring. She gently shook the rattle, observing the reactions of the little ones. To her surprise, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: joy. The sound of the offspring's laughter, their clumsy and playful movements, brought back memories of her own offspring. But this time the memory wasn't just painful. There was a sweetness to it, a warmth that warmed her heart. Hours passed without Sarah noticing. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The offspring, tired of playing, began to retreat one by one, returning to their families. Sarah watched each departure with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. When she finally found herself alone again, Sarah looked at the rattle in her hand. The simple object had transformed her day, bringing light and joy where once there was only loneliness. She realized that, even without her own offspring, she still had a lot of love to give. Carefully, Sarah stored the rattle in a small cavity of a nearby tree. She knew she would return there, that this place now had a special meaning. It was a reminder that life, even after great losses, could still bring wonderful surprises. As she prepared to return to her usual territory, Sarah felt a change within herself. The pain of loss was still there, but now there was something more: hope. Hope that perhaps she could find a new purpose, a new way to express the maternal love that still pulsed strongly in her chest. With lighter steps than in a long time, Sarah left the clearing. The forest around her seemed different now, full of possibilities. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was eager to find out. As night fell over the forest, the nocturnal sounds began to fill the air. Sarah walked towards her resting place, carrying with her not only the memories of the day, but also a new understanding of her place in this vast and mysterious world. The soft echo of the rattle seemed to follow her, a silent promise of better days to come. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but significant change in Sarah's life. The gorilla, once lonely and melancholic, now moved through the forest with a new sparkle in her eyes. The encounter with the human baby and the subsequent experience with the forest offspring had awakened something dormant within her, a sense of purpose and connection that she thought she had lost forever. Sarah established a new routine. Every morning, after feeding on the fruits and leaves that constituted her diet, she made a pilgrimage to the clearing where she had stored the rattle. The path, previously unknown to many forest inhabitants, was now marked by footprints of various animals, large and small. Upon arriving at the clearing, Sarah carefully removed the rattle from its hiding place. The simple act of holding the object in her huge hands brought a smile to her face, an expression that until recently seemed to have been forgotten. She sat in the center of the open space and gently began to shake the rattle. The soft, rhythmic sound echoed through the forest like a silent call. Gradually, the animals began to appear. First the bravest ones, the capuchin monkeys, always curious and agitated. Then came the birds landing on nearby branches, their songs mixing with the sound of the rattle. The capybaras brought their offspring, who nestled close to Sarah, feeling safe under her protective presence. As the days passed, the variety of animals gathering in the clearing increased. Even creatures that would normally avoid each other seemed to set aside their differences in this special space. Sarah watched, amazed, as predators and prey coexisted peacefully, united by curiosity and the music of the rattle. One day, as Sarah was sitting with her usual group of visitors, she noticed a movement at the edge of the clearing. To her surprise, a small jaguar emerged from the dense vegetation. The cub, obviously separated from its mother, looked at the scene with a mixture of fear and fascination. Sarah felt her heart race. She knew how dangerous an adult jaguar could be, but this cub seemed as lost and vulnerable as the human baby she had saved. Without thinking twice, she extended a gentle hand towards the small feline. The jaguar cub hesitated for a moment, its instincts fighting against curiosity. Finally, attracted by the soft sound of the rattle and Sarah's calm presence, it approached. With faltering steps, the cub reached Sarah and, to the amazement of all present, snuggled up beside her. At that instant, Sarah felt a wave of emotion so intense that it almost knocked her over. It was as if all the barriers between species had disappeared. There, in that magical clearing, she was not just a gorilla. She was a protector, a guardian of all the small and vulnerable in the forest. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Sarah's clearing became a legendary place in the forest. Stories about the gentle gorilla who cared for all offspring, regardless of their species, began to spread. Animals from all corners of the forest made pilgrimages to see the phenomenon for themselves. Sarah embraced her new role with all her heart. She dedicated her mornings to caring for the offspring that came to her. She taught the monkeys how to find the best fruits, showed the birds the safest places to build nests, and even helped the sloth cubs move with more confidence through the branches. One afternoon, as Sarah watched a group of cubs playing, she heard a distant sound that made her heart leap. It was a cry, weak and distant but unmistakable, the cry of a human baby. For a moment she was paralyzed, memories of the river rescue flooding her mind. Without hesitation, Sarah stood up. She looked at the cubs around her, as if silently asking for permission. The small animals seemed to understand, moving away to clear a path. With determined steps, Sarah began to move in the direction of the sound. As she approached, the crying became clearer. Sarah moved carefully, aware that her presence could frighten the humans. Hidden behind a large tree, she finally spotted the source of the sound, a small family of tourists who had gotten lost in the forest. The baby, exhausted and hungry, cried in its mother's arms. The parents seemed disoriented and frightened, looking around for any sign of civilization. Sarah felt a strong urge to help, but knew she couldn't reveal herself directly. Using all the intelligence and experience she had acquired over the years, Sarah began to move strategically through the forest. She intentionally broke branches, making noises that attracted the family's attention. Then, keeping herself hidden, she began to guide them. Step by step, breaking branches and moving vegetation, Sarah created a trail for the family to follow. The humans, desperate for any sign of hope, followed the sounds without questioning. Sarah skillfully guided them, avoiding dangerous areas and leading them towards a known trail that led back to civilization. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sarah heard distant voices, a rescue team searching for the lost family. Her work was done. With one last look at the baby, now calmer in its mother's arms, Sarah silently disappeared into the forest. Returning to her clearing, Sarah was greeted by curious looks from her animal protégé. She sat down heavily, exhausted but satisfied. The rattle, a faithful companion of her adventures, tinkled softly in her hand. That night, as the forest fell asleep around her, Sarah reflected on the day. She had saved once again, not just a baby, but an entire family. The sense of fulfillment that filled her was different from anything she had ever experienced. Looking at the stars shining between the tree leaves, Sarah felt a deep gratitude. Life had taken her down unexpected paths, from a zoo cage to the depths of the forest, from devastating loss to the rebirth of a purpose. Now she understood that her role went beyond being just another inhabitant of the forest. She was a guardian, a protector of all vulnerable beings that crossed her path. With this comforting thought, Sarah closed her eyes, letting herself be lulled by the soft sound of the nocturnal forest. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of possibilities and new chances to make a difference. And she would be ready, with her heart full of love and her faithful rattle by her side, to face any challenge that fate had in store for her. As the years passed, Sarah's reputation as the guardian of the forest spread quickly among the inhabitants of the woods. Her presence became legendary, not only among animals, but also among nearby human communities. Stories about a gentle gorilla who protected cubs and guided lost travelers began to circulate, mixing with local folklore. On a particularly warm morning, Sarah was in her usual clearing, surrounded by her regular protégés. The rattle, now a bit worn from constant use, rested by her side. She was tenderly watching a group of spider monkey cubs playing when an unusual noise caught her attention. It was the sound of human footsteps, but not the clumsy steps of lost tourists. These were firm, determined, as if whoever was making them knew the forest well. Sarah became alert, her curiosity mixed with a twinge of apprehension. Suddenly, from among the dense foliage, a figure emerged that made Sarah freeze. It was a man, but not just any man. She recognized him immediately. It was Paul, one of her former zookeepers. Time had left marks on his face, but the gentle eyes were the same that Sarah remembered from her days in captivity. Paul stopped upon seeing Sarah, his eyes widening in recognition and amazement. "Sarah?" he whispered, almost in disbelief. "Is it really you?" Sarah felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to run and hide in the depths of the forest, away from any reminder of her previous life. But another part, a part she didn't know still existed, felt an unexpected joy at seeing a familiar face from her past. Paul took a cautious step towards her, his hands extended in a peaceful gesture. "Easy, girl," he said softly. "Remember me. It's me, Paul. I won't hurt you." Sarah remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the man. Slowly, the memories began to flow. Paul had always been kind to her, bringing her extra fruit and speaking to her in soft tones on the days when she felt saddest at the zoo. Recovering from the initial surprise, Paul looked around, noticing the various cubs surrounding Sarah. His face lit up with a smile of understanding. "So the stories are true," he murmured. "You've become the guardian of the forest." Sarah, still cautious, picked up the rattle by her side. The movement caught Paul's attention, who looked at the object with curiosity. "What do you have there, Sarah?" he asked, taking another step forward. Instinctively, Sarah extended the rattle towards Paul. The man gently took it, examining it carefully. "Is this a baby toy?" he asked, confused. At that moment, as if answering the unasked question, one of the monkey cubs approached Paul, reaching out for the rattle. Paul, surprised, handed the object to the small primate, who immediately began to shake it, laughing with joy. The scene seemed to break any remaining tension. Sarah visibly relaxed, and Paul sat down on the ground, marveling at what he saw. "Amazing," he said, observing how the various cubs interacted peacefully around Sarah. In the minutes that followed, Paul shared with Sarah the reason for his presence in the forest. He had become a researcher, dedicating his life to studying and protecting great primates in their natural habitat. The stories about the mysterious guardian gorilla had drawn him to this part of the forest. "Sarah," Paul spoke softly, "what you're doing here is extraordinary. You're creating a natural sanctuary, a place where different species coexist in harmony. This is revolutionary." Sarah listened attentively, her intelligent eyes fixed on Paul. Although she couldn't respond with words, she felt she understood the importance of what he was saying. Paul continued, "I'd like to help protect what you've created here. We can establish a conservation area, ensure that no one disturbs this unique balance. What do you think?" Sarah tilted her head as if considering the proposal. She looked around at the cubs playing carelessly, at the forest stretching around her. Then, slowly, she extended her huge hand towards Paul. The gesture was clear, an offer of partnership, of trust. Paul, with tears in his eyes, placed his hand on Sarah's. "Thank you," he whispered. I promise we'll do this together, respecting you and everything you've built here." In the days that followed, Paul began to work tirelessly to establish a protection area around Sarah's territory. He met with local authorities, environmentalists, and community leaders, sharing the extraordinary story of the guardian gorilla and the importance of preserving the unique balance she had created. Sarah watched these changes with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Although she trusted Paul, the growing presence of humans in her forest made her uneasy. However, she soon realized that the intentions were good. The people who came now were not hunters or explorers, but scholars and conservationists, all eager to learn and protect. One afternoon, as Sarah rested in her clearing, Paul approached with an object in his hands. It was a new rattle, larger and more durable than the previous one. "I thought you might like this," he said, handing the object to Sarah. "It's more durable and makes a prettier sound. I thought it would be useful for you to call your protégé." Sarah took the new rattle, examining it carefully. She shook it gently, and the melodious sound echoed through the clearing. Immediately, cubs of various species began to approach, attracted by the new music. Paul observed the scene with a smile. "You know, Sarah," he said softly, "when you were reintroduced to nature, many of us were worried. We wondered if you would be able to adapt, if you would survive. But look at you now. You didn't just survive, you thrived. You found a greater purpose than any of us could have imagined." Sarah looked at Paul, her eyes expressing a deep understanding. She extended the new rattle towards him, as if inviting him to participate in her mission. Paul accepted the invitation, taking the rattle and shaking it gently. The sound attracted even more animals, creating a scene of harmony that seemed almost magical. At that moment, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had found not only a new home and a new purpose, but also a link between her past and her present. With Paul by her side, and a forest full of life to protect, Sarah knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Sarah and Paul remained seated side by side, observing the small paradise they had helped create. It was the beginning of a new era for the forest, an era of protection, understanding, and peaceful coexistence. And at the center of it all was Sarah, the unlikely guardian, whose extraordinary journey had touched and transformed countless lives, both human and animal. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Sarah and Paul's partnership flourished, bringing about remarkable changes in the forest. The conservation area they established became a model for wildlife protection worldwide, attracting researchers, conservationists, and eco-tourists from all corners of the globe. Sarah's daily routine evolved to accommodate her new role as the centerpiece of this unique sanctuary. Each morning she would make her rounds through the forest, checking on the various animal families under her care. The sound of her rattle became a familiar and comforting noise to all the forest inhabitants, signaling safety and protection. One particularly memorable day, as Sarah was tending to a group of orphaned chimpanzees, she heard an unfamiliar sound in the distance. It was a low rumbling noise that seemed to be getting closer. Paul, who was nearby documenting Sarah's interactions, also noticed the sound and looked concerned. "Sarah," he said softly, "I think we might have some unexpected visitors. That sounds like heavy machinery." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding and concern. She had learned over time to associate certain human sounds with potential threats to her forest home. Without hesitation, she began to gather the young chimps, ushering them towards a safer area of the forest. Paul quickly radioed the conservation team at the edge of the sanctuary. "We've got unauthorized activity on the north side," he reported. "Sounds like bulldozers or excavators. We need to investigate immediately." As Sarah ensured the safety of the animals, Paul and a team of rangers made their way towards the source of the disturbance. What they found shocked them. A group of illegal loggers had somehow breached the sanctuary's perimeter and were in the process of clearing a section of the forest. The situation was tense. The loggers, caught red-handed, were not willing to leave without a fight. As Paul and the rangers tried to reason with them, the confrontation began to escalate. Meanwhile, Sarah, having secured the animals, felt drawn to the commotion. Despite the potential danger, she knew she had to do something to protect her home. Slowly and deliberately, she made her way towards the site of the conflict. As Sarah emerged from the tree line, her impressive form silhouetted against the forest backdrop, a hush fell over both the conservation team and the loggers. The sight of a full-grown gorilla, standing upright and exuding an aura of authority, was enough to give everyone pause. Paul, seizing the moment, addressed the loggers. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Sarah. She's the guardian of this forest, and as you can see, she's not happy with your presence here." The loggers, their bravado faltering in the face of Sarah's imposing presence, began to back away from their equipment. One of them, seemingly the leader, spoke up nervously. We didn't know this was a protected area. We were just following orders." Sarah, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, did something unexpected. She picked up her rattle, which she had brought with her, and began to shake it gently. The soft, melodious sound seemed to cut through the tension in the air. As if on cue, animals began to emerge from the forest. Birds perched on nearby branches, monkeys swung from the trees, and even a family of tapirs cautiously approached the edge of the clearing. It was as if the entire forest had come to stand with Sarah in defense of their home. The loggers, now thoroughly overwhelmed, laid down their tools. "We're sorry," the leader said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and remorse. "We'll leave immediately and never come back. This place, it's unlike anything I've ever seen." As the loggers prepared to depart, leaving their equipment behind, Paul approached Sarah. "You never cease to amaze me," he said softly, placing a hand gently on her arm. "You've just prevented a disaster without a single act of aggression. You've shown them the true value of this forest." Sarah looked at Paul, her eyes conveying a deep understanding. She then turned her gaze to the retreating loggers, and in a gesture that left everyone stunned, she extended her hand towards them, offering the rattle. Paul, interpreting Sarah's intent, addressed the loggers once more. "I think Sarah wants you to have this," he said, taking the rattle and offering it to the group's leader. "Consider it a reminder of what you've witnessed here today. A reminder that there are some things in this world more valuable than timber or profit." The logger took the rattle with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, looking from Paul to Sarah. "We won't forget this, and we'll spread the word. This forest is off limits." As the loggers departed, their trucks rumbling into the distance, a sense of triumph and relief washed over the clearing. The animals, sensing that the danger had passed, began to disperse back into the forest. Sarah watched them go, a look of satisfaction on her face. Paul turned to the rangers. "Let's make sure those vehicles are escorted all the way out of the protected zone," he instructed. "And we need to reinforce our perimeter security immediately. This can't happen again." As the team sprang into action, Paul found himself alone with Sarah once more. "You know," he said, a note of wonder in his voice, "I've spent my entire career studying animal behavior, but you continually defy everything I thought I knew. You're not just protecting this forest, Sarah. You're teaching us, teaching humanity, what true coexistence looks like." Sarah responded by gently taking Paul's hand in hers, a gesture that spoke volumes. Together they began the walk back to Sarah's clearing, the events of the day having forged an even stronger bond between them. That evening, as the sun set on another eventful day in the sanctuary, Paul sat with Sarah, reflecting on how far they had come. "We've created something truly special here, Sarah," he mused. "A place where humans and animals can learn from each other, where we can demonstrate that a different way of living is possible." Sarah nodded, her eyes conveying a depth of understanding that never ceased to amaze Paul. As darkness fell and the nocturnal symphony of the forest began, both human and gorilla felt a profound sense of purpose. They had faced a significant challenge and emerged victorious, not through force, but through the power of presence and the undeniable majesty of nature. The incident with the loggers, while frightening, had ultimately strengthened the sanctuary's position. News of the event spread rapidly, and soon the story of Sarah, the gorilla guardian who peacefully turned away a logging operation, became international news. This newfound attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Donations poured in from around the world, allowing Paul and his team to expand their conservation efforts and improve the sanctuary's infrastructure. However, the increased spotlight also meant more visitors, more curiosity, and potentially more disturbances to the delicate balance Sarah had worked so hard to create. In the weeks that followed, Paul worked tirelessly to develop new protocols for managing the sanctuary. He established strict visitor guidelines, limited tour groups to small numbers, and created designated observation areas that would allow people to witness the wonders of the forest without disturbing its inhabitants. Sarah, ever adaptable, adjusted to these changes with grace. She seemed to understand the importance of allowing some human presence, recognizing that education and exposure were key to fostering a global commitment to conservation. However, she also made it clear when she felt the balance was tipping too far towards human interference, using her rattle to signal when she needed space or when the animals under her care were becoming stressed. One particular afternoon, as Paul was guiding a small group of influential conservationists through the sanctuary, they came across Sarah in a clearing. She was surrounded by a diverse group of animals. Young chimpanzees played at her feet, colorful birds perched on her shoulders, and even a young leopard lounged nearby, seemingly at peace in her presence. The visitors were awestruck. One of them, a renowned primatologist, whispered to Paul, "In all my years of study, I've never seen anything like this. The level of trust, the interspecies cooperation, it's unprecedented." Paul nodded, a proud smile on his face. Sarah has redefined what we thought was possible in terms of animal cognition and empathy. She's not just surviving in this forest, she's actively shaping it, creating a community that transcends species boundaries. As if to demonstrate this point, Sarah began to shake her rattle gently. The sound, now familiar to all inhabitants of the forest, caused a ripple of movement. Animals that had been hidden in the foliage emerged, each responding to Sarah's call in their own way. It was a breathtaking display of the complex social web Sarah had woven. The primatologist turned to Paul, her eyes shining with excitement. "This changes everything," she said. "The implications for conservation, for our understanding of animal intelligence. We need to share this with the world." Paul nodded in agreement, but added cautiously, "We do, but we need to do it in a way that protects Sarah and this sanctuary. This isn't a zoo or a research facility. It's a delicate ecosystem that we've been privileged to witness." As the group continued their tour, Paul's mind raced with the possibilities and challenges that lay ahead. He knew that Sarah's story had the power to change hearts and minds, to shift the global conversation around conservation and animal rights. But he also knew that with great power came great responsibility. That evening, as the visitors departed and the forest settled into its nightly routine, Paul sat with Sarah in their favorite clearing. The gorilla seemed pensive, as if she too were contemplating the future of their shared endeavor. "We're standing on the brink of something big, Sarah," Paul said softly. "Your influence is spreading far beyond this forest. People are starting to see animals, to see nature, differently because of you. But with that comes risks. We need to be careful, to protect what we've built here." Sarah turned her gaze to Paul, her eyes filled with an intelligence that still amazed him after all this time. She reached out and gently took the rattle from Paul's hand, shaking it softly. As always, the sound brought a sense of calm and focus. In that moment, surrounded by the nighttime sounds of the forest, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. He and Sarah had already accomplished so much, had already changed so many lives. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together, guided by Sarah's wisdom and the powerful bond they shared. As the stars twinkled overhead and the forest breathed its nightly rhythm, both human and gorilla sat in companionable silence, guardians of a precious realm where the lines between species blurred and the true potential of coexistence was realized every day. The journey ahead would be challenging, but with Sarah leading the way, Paul knew that anything was possible. As the months passed, the sanctuary continued to evolve under Sarah and Paul's joint guardianship. Their unique partnership had caught the attention of not just conservationists and animal behaviorists, but also policymakers and world leaders. The United Nations Environmental Programme had taken a particular interest in their work, seeing it as a potential model for global conservation efforts. One crisp autumn morning, Paul received a call that would change the trajectory of their mission. The UN was planning to host a landmark summit on biodiversity and conservation, and they wanted Sarah to be the centerpiece of the event. The idea was to use advanced holographic technology to bring Sarah's presence into the conference hall, allowing her to interact with world leaders in real time without leaving the sanctuary. Paul was both excited and apprehensive about the opportunity. He knew the potential impact it could have on global conservation efforts, but he was also concerned about how it might affect Sarah and the delicate balance they had established in the sanctuary. With a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, Paul made his way to Sarah's favorite clearing to share the news. As always, she was surrounded by a diverse group of animals, all coexisting peacefully in her presence. "Sarah," Paul began, settling down beside her, "we've been given an incredible opportunity, but I need your input on this." He explained the concept of the UN summit and the holographic technology that would allow Sarah to participate remotely. As he spoke, Sarah listened intently, her eyes showing a depth of understanding that still amazed Paul after all these years. "The thing is," Paul continued, "this would be a big step. It would put you and our sanctuary in the global spotlight like never before. It could lead to more protection for forests worldwide, more understanding of animal intelligence and emotions. But it also means more attention, more scrutiny. I won't agree to it unless you're comfortable with the idea." Sarah seemed to ponder this for a moment. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached for her rattle and shook it gently. The familiar sound brought a sense of calm to the clearing, and Paul noticed several animals perking up their ears in response. Slowly, Sarah extended the rattle towards Paul. He took it, understanding the gesture as Sarah's way of saying she trusted him to make the right decision for all of them. "Thank you, Sarah," Paul said softly. "I promise we'll do this on your terms. If at any point you're uncomfortable, we'll stop. This is about giving you and all the animals here a voice on the world stage." Over the next few weeks, preparations for the summit went into overdrive. A team of technicians arrived at the sanctuary to set up the holographic equipment, working under strict guidelines to minimize disruption to the animals. Paul worked closely with UN representatives to ensure that Sarah's participation would be meaningful and respectful, not just a spectacle. As the day of the summit approached, there was a palpable sense of excitement and nervous energy throughout the sanctuary. Even the animals seemed to pick up on it, with many of Sarah's regular companions staying closer to her than usual. On the morning of the event, Paul found Sarah in her clearing, surrounded by an even larger group of animals than normal. It was as if the entire forest had gathered to support her on this momentous day. "Are you ready, Sarah?" Paul asked gently. Sarah met his gaze with her usual calm intelligence. She picked up her rattle and shook it softly, the sound rippling through the clearing. One by one, the animals began to disperse, returning to their habitats as if understanding the importance of the moment. As they made their way to the area where the holographic equipment had been set up, Paul couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and emotion. What had started as a simple act of kindness, Sarah saving a human child, had led to this moment, where a gorilla was about to address world leaders on behalf of the natural world. The technicians gave Paul the signal that they were ready to begin. With a deep breath, he turned to Sarah. "Remember, you're not alone in this. I'll be right here with you, and the whole forest is behind you. Just be yourself. That's more than enough." As the holographic transmission began, Sarah's image was projected into the UN conference hall thousands of miles away. The assembled world leaders gasped in awe as the lifelike representation of the majestic gorilla appeared before them. Paul's voice came through the speakers, providing context and translation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Sarah, the guardian of the forest. She stands before you today as a representative not just of her own species, but of all the creatures who cannot speak for themselves. Through her actions and her presence, she will demonstrate the true meaning of coexistence and the urgent need for global conservation efforts." As Sarah began to interact with the holographic environment, moving around the virtual conference hall and making eye contact with various leaders, the room fell into a hushed silence. Her movements were graceful yet purposeful, her gaze intelligent and piercing. At one point, Sarah paused in front of the holographic representation of the UN Secretary General. With slow, deliberate movements, she extended her hand, offering her rattle. The Secretary General, moved by the gesture, reached out as if to take it, his hand passing through the hologram, but the intent clear to all. "Sarah is offering you her rattle," Paul explained, his voice thick with emotion. "In our sanctuary, this rattle has become a symbol of trust, of shared responsibility for the well-being of all creatures. By offering it to you, Sarah is extending that trust to all of you and asking you to join her in protecting our shared home." The impact of the moment was profound. Many of the assembled leaders were visibly moved, some wiping away tears. As Sarah continued her virtual tour of the conference hall, pausing to interact with various delegates, it became clear that this was more than just a technological showcase. It was a paradigm shift in how humans perceived their relationship with the natural world. As the session came to a close, the Secretary General addressed the Assembly. What we have witnessed today is nothing short of revolutionary. Sarah has shown us that the lines we draw between species are far more blurred than we ever imagined. She has demonstrated intelligence, empathy, and a capacity for cooperation that challenges our preconceptions. Moving forward, we must reconsider our approach to conservation and our relationship with the natural world. We must strive to create more sanctuaries like the ones Sarah and Dr. Anderson have established, where humans and animals can coexist in harmony. As the holographic transmission ended and Sarah's image faded from the UN hall, Paul turned to the real Sarah beside him, his eyes brimming with tears of pride and hope. "You did it, Sarah. You've changed the world today." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes reflecting a mixture of satisfaction and something that looked remarkably like hope. She gently took the rattle from Paul's hand and shook it, its soft sound echoing through the forest. It was as if she was calling all of nature to witness this turning point in history. As news of Sarah's unprecedented address spread around the world, the impact was immediate and far-reaching. Social media exploded with images and videos of the event. Conservation organizations reported record donations, and governments began to draft new, more stringent environmental protection laws. But perhaps the most profound change was happening right there in the sanctuary. As Paul and Sarah made their way back to her clearing, they were joined by an ever-growing procession of animals. It was as if the entire forest was celebrating this milestone, this moment when their guardian had given them a voice on the world stage. As they reached the clearing, Sarah settled into her usual spot, surrounded by her diverse family of forest creatures. Paul sat beside her, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this point. "You know, Sarah," he said softly, "when I first found you here in this forest, I thought I was going to be the one teaching and guiding you. But the truth is, you've been the teacher all along. You've shown us what's possible when we open our hearts and minds to the world around us." Sarah responded by gently placing her hand on Paul's shoulder, a gesture of companionship and shared purpose. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, both human and gorilla sat in contented silence, guardians of a new era of understanding and coexistence. The journey ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, but with Sarah's wisdom and the growing global awareness she had sparked, the future looked brighter than ever. The unlikely partnership between a human scientist and a gorilla guardian had set in motion a wave of change that would ripple through generations to come, forever altering the way humanity viewed its place in the natural world. As the weeks following Sarah's groundbreaking UN appearance unfolded, the sanctuary experienced an unprecedented surge of interest from around the globe. Scientists, conservationists, and policymakers clamored for the opportunity to visit and learn from this unique environment. Paul found himself working tirelessly to balance the influx of attention with the need to protect the delicate ecosystem they had nurtured. One crisp morning, as Paul made his way to Sarah's clearing for their daily check-in, he was surprised to find her already awake and alert, surrounded by an unusually large gathering of animals. There was an air of anticipation in the clearing, as if nature itself was holding its breath in expectation of something momentous. As Paul approached, Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with an intensity he had never seen before. She reached for her rattle and shook it with a deliberate rhythm, different from her usual gentle shake. The animals around her stirred, their attention focused on the forest's edge. Suddenly, from the dense foliage emerged a sight that made Paul's heart skip a beat. A small group of gorillas, cautiously making their way into the clearing. Paul recognized them immediately. They were from a nearby wild population that had been struggling due to habitat loss and poaching. Sarah slowly stood and made her way towards the newcomers. The lead gorilla, an imposing silverback, met her gaze with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. For a tense moment, Paul held his breath, unsure of how this encounter would unfold. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Paul's eyes, Sarah extended her hand, offering her precious rattle to the silverback. The wild gorilla hesitated for a moment before gently taking the rattle. He examined it curiously before shaking it, mimicking Sarah's earlier actions. The sound seemed to break the tension in the clearing. The newcomers began to relax, and Sarah guided them further into the sanctuary. Paul watched in awe as Sarah introduced the wild gorillas to her diverse family of forest creatures, showing them the peaceful coexistence she had fostered. As the day progressed, Paul observed the integration of the new gorillas into the sanctuary. Sarah patiently showed them the best foraging spots, safe resting areas, and even introduced them to some of the gentler human researchers who frequented the area. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Paul sat with Sarah, watching the new gorillas settle into a corner of the clearing for the night. "Sarah," he said softly, "what you've done today, it's incredible. You've not only created a safe haven for different species, but you're now extending that protection to your own kind. You're rewriting the rules of conservation." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. She reached out and took Paul's hand, a gesture that never failed to move him. In that moment, Paul understood that their mission had evolved. They weren't just maintaining a sanctuary anymore. They were actively expanding it, offering hope and safety to animals beyond their borders. Over the next few months, more wild gorillas found their way to the sanctuary. Each time, Sarah would welcome them, using her rattle as a symbol of peace and acceptance. The sanctuary was growing, not just in numbers but in its significance as a model for conservation. News of this development spread quickly through the scientific community and beyond. The image of Sarah, once a captive gorilla, now leading and protecting a growing population of wild gorillas, captured the world's imagination. It was a powerful symbol of resilience, adaptation, and the potential for positive change. Governments and conservation organizations took notice. Proposals for creating wildlife corridors connecting the sanctuary to other protected areas began to gain traction. The idea was to allow for the safe movement of animals between habitats, reducing the risk of inbreeding and promoting biodiversity. Paul found himself increasingly involved in these larger conservation efforts, often consulting with policymakers and environmental experts. But no matter how busy he became, he always made time for his daily visits with Sarah. One afternoon, as they sat in their usual spot overlooking the now bustling sanctuary, Paul reflected on how far they had come. "You know, Sarah," he mused, "when I first found you here, I thought we were just creating a safe space for you and a few other animals. But look at what it's become. You've created a model that could change the face of conservation worldwide." Sarah listened intently, her eyes showing that deep understanding that never ceased to amaze Paul. She picked up her rattle, now weathered and worn from constant use, and shook it gently. As always, the sound brought a sense of peace and purpose to the clearing. Suddenly, a commotion from the edge of the clearing caught their attention. A group of young gorillas, a mix of the original sanctuary inhabitants and the newcomers, came bounding into the open space. They were playing with what looked like makeshift rattles, crafted from hollow branches and pebbles. Paul watched in astonishment as the young gorillas mimicked Sarah's movements, shaking their rattles and gathering the other animals around them. It was as if they were learning to become guardians themselves, carrying on Sarah's legacy. "Oh, Sarah," Paul breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you see what you've started? You're not just protecting these animals, you're teaching them to protect each other. You're creating a whole new generation of guardians." Sarah watched the young gorillas with what Paul could only describe as pride. She then turned to Paul and did something she had never done before. She handed him her rattle. The gesture was clear. It was time for Paul to take a more active role in this shared mission. With trembling hands, Paul accepted the rattle. He understood the weight of the responsibility Sarah was entrusting to him. Together, they would continue to expand their vision, to push the boundaries of what was possible in conservation and interspecies cooperation. As the sun set on another remarkable day in the sanctuary, Paul and Sarah sat side by side, watching the young gorillas play. The sound of rattles, both old and new, filled the air, a symphony of hope for the future. They had created something truly extraordinary, a place where the lines between species blurred, where cooperation and understanding flourished, and where the true potential of coexistence was realized every day. The journey ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, but with Sarah's wisdom, Paul's dedication, and the growing community of animal guardians they were nurturing, the future of the sanctuary, and perhaps of conservation itself, looked brighter than ever. The unlikely partnership between a human scientist and a gorilla guardian had indeed set in motion a wave of change that would ripple through generations to come, forever altering the way humanity viewed its place in the natural world. As darkness fell and the forest settled into its nightly routine, Paul and Sarah remained in the clearing, silent guardians of a precious realm where miracles happened every day. The stars twinkled overhead, bearing witness to a revolution in conservation that had started with a simple act of kindness and blossomed into a movement that was changing the world, one rattle shake at a time. As the years passed, the sanctuary continued to thrive and expand under Sarah and Paul's guidance. Their model of conservation and interspecies cooperation became renowned worldwide, inspiring similar projects across the globe. The rattle, once a simple toy, had become a symbol of hope and unity in conservation efforts everywhere. Sarah, now an elderly gorilla, spent most of her days in her favorite clearing, surrounded by the diverse family she had cultivated over the years. Though her movements had slowed, her eyes still held the same wisdom and compassion that had changed countless lives. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves were turning golden, Paul made his way to the clearing for his daily visit with Sarah. He found her resting peacefully against her favorite tree, her faithful rattle by her side. As he approached, he noticed something different in Sarah's demeanor, a sense of contentment and completion. "Good morning, old friend," Paul said softly, sitting beside her. Sarah turned to him, her eyes full of warmth and understanding. She reached for her rattle, shaking it gently one last time. The familiar sound echoed through the clearing, drawing animals from all corners of the sanctuary. As the forest creatures gathered around them, Paul realized with a heavy heart what was happening. Sarah was saying goodbye. Tears welled up in his eyes as he watched the incredible gorilla who had revolutionized conservation and touched so many lives prepare for her final journey. Sarah looked at each of the animals around her, as if giving them a final blessing. Then, with a gentle motion, she placed the rattle in Paul's hands. The message was clear. It was now his responsibility to carry on their shared mission. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the clearing, Sarah closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the family she had created and protected. The forest fell into a reverent silence, as if nature itself was paying tribute to its extraordinary guardian. In the days that followed, news of Sarah's passing spread around the world. Tributes poured in from scientists, world leaders, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Sarah's story. The sanctuary became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to pay their respects and witness the legacy she had left behind. Paul, though heartbroken, found strength in the responsibility Sarah had entrusted to him. He continued to lead the sanctuary, working tirelessly to expand their conservation efforts and spread Sarah's message of interspecies harmony. Years turned into decades, and the sanctuary grew into a vast protected area, connecting with other conservation zones to form a continent-spanning wildlife corridor. The principles of coexistence and mutual respect that Sarah had embodied became the foundation for a new approach to conservation worldwide. On the 10th anniversary of Sarah's passing, Paul stood in the clearing where it had all began. He was older now, his hair grey, but his eyes still shone with the passion Sarah had ignited in him all those years ago. Surrounded by a new generation of animal guardians, both human and non-human, he raised Sarah's old rattle. As he shook it, the familiar sound rippling through the forest, Paul smiled. Sarah's legacy lived on in every animal that called the sanctuary home, in every conservationist inspired by her story, and in the global movement she had sparked. "Thank you, Sarah," Paul whispered to the wind, "for showing us the way." As if in response, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of rattles shaking in sanctuaries around the world. Sarah's journey had come to an end, but the revolution she started continued to grow, promising a future where humans and animals could truly live in harmony. And so the story of Sarah, the gorilla who became a guardian, came to a close. But her legacy, a tale of compassion, wisdom, and the extraordinary bonds that can form between species, would be told for generations to come, inspiring countless others to become guardians of the natural world. In sanctuaries, classrooms, and forests around the globe, the sound of rattles continued to ring out, a reminder of the incredible gorilla who had changed the world, one act of kindness at a time.